Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thanks for coming. I'm Yerevan Saeed, the Barzani Scholar in residence here at the SIS, and I'm also the director for the Global Kurdish Initiative for Peace School of International Service. It's really my great honor and privilege to welcome my provost, Ambassador Douglas Siliman, the president of the Arab Development Institute in Washington, the School of International Service. For this very timely discussion about, the Middle East and also Iraq. I'm very grateful for your presence here, Mr. Ambassador. Thanks for coming. I understand that you came back from the Middle East just last night, so you must be very tired. So thank you very, very much for coming. It's clear that emotions are running high when discussing the Middle East, and I understand also share those emotions and also feelings. But it's really important for us to engage in a dialogue that's, productive and help resolving problems and find solution, and also help, improving the situation there. Ambassador Siliman is a distinguished diplomat with extensive background and experience in the Middle East. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Iraq at Kuwait and held key position at the Department of State, focusing on Iraq and also Turkey and also other Middle Eastern and also broader Middle East. He is currently serves on the board of advisors of bilateral U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce. And also, he's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and the American Academy for Diplomacy. He has received numerous awards, including the Presidential Distinguished Service Award. He retired from Foreign Service in 2019 after 35 years of dedicated service. And that retirement actually had consequences for my professional life that I'm going to discuss in a bit. Mr. Ambassador holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Bellows University and also a Master's in International Relations from George Washington University. He's fluent in French and also Arabic, but we're going to do our panel in English. Ambassador, before we start, there's a confession that I want to make for you. When I was working at the Arab Gulf Institute in Washington for 7 years, I harbored very secret ambition of staging a coup and become the internal president of the institute. In fact, I thought, that makes perfect sense because I'm from the Middle East and also the institute focus on the Middle East. You have these rare combinations of, the right person for the job and also the right, the environment. Unfortunately, my dreams were shattered when the ambassador was democratically hired in 2019 to become the president of the institute. And following the January 6th Capitol attack, I found myself become a strong believer of telepathy, given the HSAW's close proximity to the White House. I entertained the notion that my thoughts might have accidentally inspired or influenced someone at the Oval Office. So for some time, I was searching, the countries that has no extradition treaty with the U.S., just in case I would be called for investigation. So rest assured, our dean is here. I don't have such a Machiavellian intentions here at SIS. On a more, serious note, Ambassador, I fondly miss our chats in the morning at our kitchen, in the office, talking about Kurdish and Iraqi politics. I know that you're talking about Kurdish food and kebab. That's exactly why we have Kurdish kebab ordered for you. I hope that you're going to enjoy it, and also the taste will take you back to the good times that you spent in Kurdistan, the time when Kurdistan was the top vacation destination for diplomats, for expats, and also even for the American soldiers serving in Iraq. So I'm really, it's been one of the great highlights of my life working with you at the edge at the Archaeology Institute in Washington. The ambassador is going to give his remarks about the Middle East. As I mentioned, he has come back, he's fresh, he has lots of ideas. He has talked with numerous people, gave lectures, he met with officials. So he has a lot to say. So he's going to talk about history and also the Biden administration's policy towards Iraq, more specifically, also the broader Middle East. And then we're going to sit here. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we are going to open the floor for Q&A. And after that, of course, we're going to eat some kebab as well, as usual. That's what our program is really known for. We're going to offer kebab and Kurdish food. So I encourage you every time when we have, these events, come and enjoy our, Kurdish food. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Yerevan, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me here today. As Yerevan said, this time yesterday, I was in the middle of a 15-hour flight between Abu Dhabi and Washington. So if I fall asleep during my remarks, please forgive me. I will forgive you if you also fall asleep during my remarks. Today, I want to start with some very, very broad policy discussions and then gradually make our way into the Middle East. And at the end of the talk, to Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan. I'm going to leave a lot of time at the end of the talk for your questions to make sure that we focus on the things that interest you. And hopefully I will have some answers or at least suggestions that I can make. But like Yerevan, I have a confession to make. For me, I was a Cold War kid. I was born in the 1960s. And when I grew up, it became absolutely obvious to me that the world was divided into two. It was Americans and Russians. It was Democrats and communists. It was free people and oppressed people. And the world at that point was truly bipolar. And most of the countries in the world, most organizations in the world leaned to one of the two poles, the United States or the Soviet Union. For a long time, mostly from the end of World War II, a lot of the policy of the world was put in that framework. But then in July of 1991, things changed very, very quickly and in a big way. There was a military coup against the chairman of the Soviet Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev. The Soviet Union collapsed and the USSR became 15 separate countries. So within just a few months, the United States went from being one of two poles in the world to the sole political, economic, military, and cultural superpower in the world. Suddenly, the world had become unipolar. And most of the world focused squarely on what the United States was doing and what we wanted other people to do. And the new unipolar world created a geopolitical environment in which a lot of important things happened. I mean, first of all, there was truly a Pax Americana with an expanded US security role that most of the world agreed to. Secondly, NATO expanded, especially expanded when countries that had been part of the Soviet Union or under Soviet domination decided that they never wanted to be under Russian tutelage again. They joined NATO. Third, Europe deepened their collective ties to the European Union, both economically or especially economically, but at the same time, they largely disinvested in security realm and invested their hard-earned tax dollars into developing their own economies. Fourth, there was also great domestic investment and development in much of the rest of the world. And then finally, for the United States, we kind of became the target for anyone who was unhappy with anything anywhere in the world. We became, since we were the big dog on the block, it was easiest to blame the United States for what was going wrong anywhere in the world. In the United States, for better or worse, we fought two wars of choice in Afghanistan and in Iraq. We entered the global war on terrorism after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, and we deployed tens of thousands of US troops to the Middle East. And in fact, when I was the ambassador to Kuwait, we had the third largest number of troops of any country in the world behind Japan and South Korea in Kuwait. This was America's unipolar world, and the world looked up to us, the world listened to us, the world was afraid of us. And frankly, for an American diplomat, this was a really heady time because wherever you went, people gave you respect, they gave you deference. Frankly, it was a really heady time to be an American as well, where a lot of American politicians learned that they could make suggestions to foreign governments that would suddenly come true in that government's foreign policy. But the world is changing again in a fundamental way. A lot of Americans have grown tired of funding the defense of the rest of the world. They're tired of having America's sons and daughters sent overseas to wars that they don't really know why they're going on. And frankly, during the Pax Americana, domestic investment in China, in South Korea, in most of Europe, in Turkey, Brazil, Mexico, and parts of the Middle East brought an era of very strong, consistent economic growth. But while the United States economy grew, most of these other economies grew faster than the United States because we were so big. We still remain the largest economy, the most culturally and influential and most innovative society, and have the strongest military, but we are no longer the world's sole political, economic, military, or cultural superpower. China, and to a lesser extent, Russia, are now near-peer competitors, Russia again. But there's something new in the equation. There is a growing number of ambitious regional players, a growing number of countries that prioritize what they define as their own national interests over the interests of an ideology, a bloc, or some ideas that come out of their past. So Turkey, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, India, South Africa, and even smaller countries like Israel and the United Arab Emirates are now charting separate economic, political, and security courses and becoming regional economic, cultural, and military powers as well. What the world faces now is not one or two or three superpowers, but a larger number of ambitious regional and global players. The world is now, for lack of a better term, multipolar. Now, a lot of people object to that term because it sort of comes out of the past history. Some people want to say that it is multifaceted or hyper-connected or intermeshed or networked. I don't really care what terminology you use. What it means is that there isn't one major dominant power. And frankly, political and economic and military blocs have less importance now than they did a decade ago. And this is the environment in which the United States must now operate. Now, the reason I start with this background is because most Americans, and certainly most American politicians, do not realize that this has happened. Politicians from both parties continue to make unrealistic demands on American administrations in power, assuming that if the USG snaps its fingers, another country will change its trade policy, will end a war, will give some quick cash for humanitarian assistance that we pay for, or simply do what the United States wants. This was never true. I mean, from as 35 years as a diplomat, it was never true. It took a lot more work than that. Even though many imagine that it was true, but it is certainly not true anymore. But many Americans and many American politicians are still stuck in that unipolar American dominant mindset. So it's in this context that I want to turn to the Middle East. And I want to talk about Biden administration policy and how it's evolved over the past 3 years. So when Joe Biden became president in 2021, foreign policy was not his priority. The administration focused on domestic issues, the great divisions within American society, combating COVID and recovering from COVID, domestic economic growth with a focus on infrastructure investment and climate change resilience. When foreign policy came up, it was mostly about reestablishing America's relationships with its key European and Asian allies, dealing with the challenge of owing China economically and militarily, and watching an unpredictable threat from Russia. The Middle East was not even in the top 5 issues that the Biden administration was looking at. When the Middle East was addressed, certainly in 2021, it was usually in the context of getting back to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. Some of this lack of focus on the Middle East came from domestic disagreements and the beginning of politicization of U.S. Middle East foreign policy. It started particularly under George W. Bush with wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it got a little worse under President Obama. It got really divisive under President Trump and has continued to be partisan under President Biden. So now in Washington, Republicans and Democrats in the Middle East can only agree on one issue, and that is support for Israel. Except even now, after the October 7th terrorist attacks and Israel's overreaction to those attacks, that's no longer even 100% true, because you see some changes in the way that Americans are looking at support for Israel. Now, these partisan differences are also evident in Biden's national security strategy, which wasn't until the end of 2022, more than 18 months into the administration. But I want to go through how this was structured, because it'll give you some sense why the Middle East was so low on the list of priorities for the Biden administration, and what has happened in the past couple of months, especially since the war in Gaza, has pushed this back in front of the president and his team. First of all, the national security strategy is based on two overarching themes. The first is democracies versus autocracies, but without a clear national polar focus for either of these two ideas. And frankly, in my opinion, this focus on this bipolar democracies versus autocracies completely misses the real trends that are happening in the world, as I explained earlier. The second thing is domestic investment to strengthen U.S. competitive economic edge overseas. And again, this was as much domestic industrial policy as it was foreign policy. So it was really talking about how to make sure that the United States has a good market share of all sorts of products around the world. Now, after that first 8 or 9 pages of the document, they list the foreign policy priorities. There were 15 of them, there were 16 of them. Number one, not surprisingly, was China. Number two was Russia. But after that, and sort of reflecting the partisan divides, you had climate change and energy, pandemics, food insecurity, arms control and non-proliferation, terrorism, technology, cyberspace, trade and economics, and then the Indo-Pacific region focused on China, Europe focused on Russia, democracy in the Western Hemisphere, and then number 14 on the list was the Middle East, with Africa and the Arctic bringing up the tail end. And just to drive this point home a little bit more, the specific Middle East goals and the national security strategy are on page 42 of the 48-page document. I usually have a copy in my office. I brought it with me, but I forgot to bring it in. Not too subtle a reminder of where the Biden administration was focused, at least in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. So perhaps recognizing last year that they really hadn't focused much on the Middle East, the White House coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa, Brett McGurk, pitched what he termed a Biden doctrine for the Middle East. And what he did is he took that information on page 42 and 43 of the national security strategy and squeezed it into 5 ideas. And I will go through those 5 just to give you a sense of what they're talking about. Number 1 was partnerships. Partnerships with countries that, quote, support the rules-based international order, unquote. In other words, those that support America's global leadership and the rules that we had put in place politically and economically post-World War II. Second idea, a focus on deterrence, things like protecting the freedom of navigation and the drive to, quote, enhance the deterrent capacity of our allies, end quote, but without mentioning in any way arms sales or military training or cooperation with any of our friends and allies in the Middle East. Third, the use of diplomacy to deter threats, reduce tensions, and end conflicts. Fourth, the integration with our friends in the Middle East, the creation of political, economic, and security connections among U.S. friends and allies. And fifth, values, the promotion of human rights, humanitarian assistance, and all in the spirit of, quote, urging our partners to act in words and deeds in line with the essential principles of the UN Charter, unquote. What I see in this Biden doctrine that Brett McGurk laid out is, I think, a little bit more realistic and in many ways at odds with what the national security strategy actually said. It brushed over some very difficult political issues with some of our allies in the Middle East, but it did at least appear to put a framework on how to deal with the Middle East within this national security strategy. So this is where U.S. policy stood on October 6th of 2023. But the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th was a truly strategic terrorist attack. It has changed the way that people look at the world. It has changed the way that countries interact with each other. And for better or worse, it has put Hamas on the map as the leader of Palestinians. And Israel's overly harsh military response in Gaza and America's almost unquestioning support of Israel, but not quite complete, has also threatened America's relationships around the world, but also particularly in the Middle East. And it has unfortunately thrown a lot of Biden administration foreign policy in the Middle East and in other parts of the world into disarray. In general, even since October 7th, the Biden administration has not changed its overall objectives or strategy, but it has certainly changed the short-term. It has changed the short-term viability of some of the priorities that they had put on the table, like the U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia trilateral agreement, or expanded cooperation with the militaries of the countries in the Gulf. Now, since this is a lecture under the auspices of the Mustafa Barzani Scholar here at SIS, I'm going to end with a few comments on Iraq. And again, I'm going to start with some history, but I want to really spark thinking and get you guys to ask questions when I actually sit down here with Yerevan, and we can talk through a little bit about Iraq. Well, as somebody who in 2002, 2003 opposed the war in Iraq, I thought that we went to war with very sparse evidence of Iraqi involvement in the 9/11 terrorist attacks, very sparse evidence of any production of nuclear or chemical weapons. And I think that the U.S. invaded largely to try to help set up in Iraq a democratic ally that would help stabilize the region. That obviously did not turn out the way that it was planned. U.S. officials worked very hard during the period of drafting the Iraqi constitution to write a document that would be flexible, that would find some way to unify Iraqis behind a political system, yet leave enough autonomy for the very diverse populations of Iraq to have greater self-governance and greater input into their own lives. Unfortunately, that constitution failed to do a number of things. What they did is they punted to a future Iraqi parliament to, create a Senate-like body that would be less susceptible to the extremes of public opinion. In other words, the reason the framers of the American Constitution 250 years ago created the Senate was that they wanted a body to be statesmanlike and calm, and then a body that was elected more often and represented the views of the people. That was the idea behind the discussions in the Iraqi Parliamentary Convention, but the second half of that was never put into place. They also did not put into place the definition of who owned oil resources and gas resources, who should produce them, where should the revenues go, how should they be shared. They also mentioned that there were controversies over the internal boundaries of Iraq between the different provinces, but left that to a future parliament to rectify. They also did not clarify, or rather had contradictory clauses in the Constitution about the responsibilities of autonomous regions, which up to this point is still just the Iraqi Kurdistan region. But there was a thought at the time of the Constitutional Convention that there would in fact be other parts of the state that would take multiple provinces, collect them, and have an KRG-like autonomous region. And they put in place a proportional representational system for the parliament that almost assured that strong independent candidates and individual voices would not be elected because you have to vote for a party list, not for individuals. And when this was changed for one election in 2021, you got a completely different character to the Iraqi parliament, which some of the powerful forces, particularly among the Shia militias, quickly turned back for the coming elections to proportional representation by province again. I was in Iraq for 3 tours. I was in Iraq in 2011 when U.S. forces withdrew from Iraq. And what I was worried about at that time, although I supported the withdrawal of U.S. forces, was that there would be a real diminution of American support and influence on the Iraqi military. We no longer had the same levels of military assistance going to Iraq, and we had far fewer U.S. forces in country to help mentor and train and give the Iraqi military a kind of esprit de corps that it had not had before. And unfortunately, my fears were realized in 2014 when the fighters of ISIS came across the Syrian border into northwestern Iraq, and essentially in the face of a far superior or far inferior force, the Iraqi army often just laid down its weapons, including getting out of and abandoning M1A1 main battle tanks in the face of a Toyota Hilux pickup truck with 6 guys with AK-47s in the back. It was probably the support of the United States and the international coalition to defeat ISIS that the Iraqi military was rebuilt sufficiently, got the fighting experience, and had the help in doctrine and tactics to eventually defeat ISIS in 2017. But I'll also give some credit to Iran, because Iran also provided a lot of assistance to military units in Iraq during that period, with the purpose of defeating ISIS, yes, but also with the purpose of building up allied military forces in Iraq, whether you call them militias, part of the Hashd al-Shaabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces. It doesn't really matter. You now have a series of Iranian trained and Iranian supported military forces that have 1 foot in the Iraqi government as part of the Hashd al-Shaabi and 1 foot in the axis of resistance as an independent militia. And they change their hats or change the flags that they use, literally depending upon the operations that they are conducting. Wow. So where are we today? Should we be in Iraq? What should we be doing in Iraq? What worries me a little bit is that, as Yerevan said, the Hamas attack on Israel was going to encourage a lot of people who had thought Palestine had been forgotten about. But the overly exuberant Israeli response, the number of civilian casualties, have cemented a lot of Arab opinion against Israel and in favor of Palestinians. But it has also given a lot of countries like Iran and organizations an excuse to pursue their own ends, really independent of Palestine. You've seen this in Iraq with it now, I think 170-ish attacks on US and coalition forces inside the country from militias that are theoretically part of the Iraqi government in many cases. You have seen this in Yemen as Ansar Allah, the Houthis, shoot missiles and rockets at international shipping. And you've seen continued Iranian support for many of these groups. Again, the excuse for this has been Israel's treatment of Palestinians. I guess a decent excuse, but the reality in their strategic and tactical evaluation is that they can use this to try to achieve their other goals. For example, for Iran, for many of the militias in Iraq, to force American and Western forces out of the country. I will end this by saying what I think the United States should be doing in Iraq. And I'm also interested in you guys looking, not only criticizing what the United States has done in Iraq, but what is it that the United States should be doing that might help American interests, first of all, but what can we do to help Iraq and Iraqis develop? So the things that I saw that were probably the most effective, in addition to the military training and mentoring that I mentioned earlier, is education programs. We have conducted a lot of English language education programs, which I have found very important because Iraq is now connected to the world through the internet. Every young Iraqi's got a mobile phone, but if you speak only Arabic, you're going to see only the sources that are in Arabic. If you learn how to speak a little bit of English, you can open up your aperture on information. We also want to bring more Iraqi students at a younger age, high school or as undergraduates to the United States. I know that there are now ideas on how to make that happen, although congressional fund that and Iraqi government funding for that has been pretty small. Another great comparative advantage of the United States is in economics, particularly in banking, in anti-corruption, and in ways to help rationalize the Iraqi economy and as a base goal, connect it to the outside world. Right now, the Iraqi economy is mostly tied to the Iranian economy. And unfortunately for Iraq, this is old information because they had probably 5 years old, but I doubt that it's changed much. The economic interplay between Iran and Iraq is about 95% Iranian goods going into Iraq being paid for by Iraq. It's very much against the benefit of Iraqi farmers and Iraqi merchants, and it is largely pushed by not all of these corrupt deals, but there's a lot of remember hearing farmers in Basra complain that Iranians were dumping low-priced cucumbers, carrots, and other vegetables on the Basra vegetable market, and it was pushing Iraqi farmers out of the market. They couldn't actually pay for the fertilizer and the transportation that they needed to get their crops to market. This is something that the United States can help with through small business loans, and frankly, just helping them better enforce customs at the border. Another really big issue for Iraq is climate change resilience. Iraq is according to the UN, one of the 5 countries that will be most affected by climate change in terms of water shortages and rise in temperatures. I applaud Ambassador Lena Romanowski, the current American ambassador to Iraq, because she has focused Iraqis on the need to work on these issues and has been able to implement, with the permission of the Iraqi government, a number of things that will help them hopefully use their water better. And then finally, I think it is important for Iraq to expand its foreign relations, particularly in the region. The previous Prime Minister, Mustafa Kadhimi, started a very interesting and hopefully ultimately more productive relationship with Egypt and with Jordan. His predecessor also is the one who began the discussions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which ultimately led to the restoration of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which has significantly calmed tensions between those two countries. I think that Iraq in the future can play a greater role in this kind of regional integration because it is seen as being able to deal with all the countries in the region favorably and easily. I'm going to stop here and let Yerevan quiz me and give you guys a chance to talk about this. I am, as somebody who spent 5 years living in Baghdad, as somebody who has visited the marshes and walked on the ziggurat in Ur and visited the tomb of the Prophet Nahum in Al-Qush to the north of Mosul, it's an amazing country. And what worries me about Iraq is that the people who are currently governing Iraq have very little regard for the future of the country as a whole. And they have been focused much more on the benefits to their own tribes, their own communities, their own ethnic groups, than overarching good of the entire country. How that can be accomplished is going to have to be done gradually. Whether or not Iraq can recover from imperfect constitution and people who are willing to break the rules to way in certain parts of the governance of the country, I don't know, but ultimately I hope Iraq will be successful. Iraq remains a rich country in terms of agriculture and natural resources, but only a government that is willing to make the proper decisions to distribute that wealth and use it productively is going to be ultimately successful. So thank you all very much. And Yerevan, I'll let you quiz me a bit.
So that we need to use these microphones and turn it on. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, for the very comprehensive analysis of the Middle East and your specific comments on Iraq. You mentioned how the Middle East really is at the bottom of the list for the Biden administration, but for me there appears to be a mismatch between the doctrine and also what is happening on the ground. And the Middle East seems to be one of the most powerful geopolitical forces. Once you are there, it doesn't let you go. And that's what's happening to the United States since, George W. Bush, we have been trying to get out of there, President Obama, Trump, and, the current president, and we're still there. We're still, striking militia groups, and we're trying to protect it, ourselves. So what will be the status of the U.S.-Iraqi relationship militarily and also diplomatically, especially the time that today the Iraqi Foreign Minister Fawad Hussein described the U.S.-Iraqi relationship damaged. And he expressed a lot of frustration regarding how Iran and the United States do not have any regards for the Iraqi sovereignty. What the United States should do to alter its approach to respect Iraq, but also to protect its interests in the region.
One of the things that I found in 3 tours of duty in Iraq is that there's a unique idea about sovereignty in Iraq that doesn't necessarily pertain in other places in the world. Sovereignty or lack of sovereignty for Iraqi officials, at least in the times that I was there, were threats that came from outside of Iraq. It had nothing to do with society or threats coming from inside the country. And to be completely honest, I think the largest threat to Iraqi sovereignty right now is the unwillingness of some militia groups and or communities in the country to recognize the sovereignty of the government in Baghdad. Now, that's for a whole bunch of different reasons. But it is the intervention of the United States in military strikes that you've seen over the past couple of months that is largely a reaction to the inability of the Iraqi government to control all of the elements of the armed forces of Iraq that are in theory under the control of the prime minister, and unwilling to control those that are not actually associated with the Iraqi armed forces, which should be considered, illegal criminal gangs, and not doing that as well. Some of this is the long-term division among Iraqi political factions, a vision of some for an independent Kurdistan, a vision of others of an Iraq that should be run by the Shia majority so that Iraq will never have another dictator like Saddam Hussein who will hurt minority communities, including. But the reality is Iraq has yet to develop a national identity that includes all of the identities that are in Iraq. And I say that even though in my conversations with many Iraqis, that they understand and appreciate nature of diverse populations and the diverse history of Iraq. Great respect for Christians, great respect for Kurds, great respect for Sabians, great respect for Sunnis and Shias who are no longer tribal or religious, but have become secular and educated and look at Iraq differently. But in the practice of politics, it is still those who are willing to use force and go beyond what the law says should be used, who have been piling up victories since 2003. So again, it's not a really good answer to that question, but I would say when Iraqis look at the sovereignty of Iraq, they can certainly look at what the United States and what Iran are doing to damage that sovereignty, but they have to realize that the government in Baghdad has not yet been effectively able to exercise its own sovereignty inside the country. And that needs to be a focus as well.
Thank you. Since you talked about, prescribe some recommendation about what the U.S. should do to help Iraq, I'm going to press you about what the U.S. should do to help the Kurds. As you know, historically, changes the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has impacted the Kurds tragically since 1960s and 70s up to even 2017 when you were serving as an ambassador in Iraq. If the U.S. were to withdraw from Iraq and Syria, today, and it could happen, what would be the impact on the Kurds and the Kurdistan region, and what measures the Biden administration or the next administration should take to protect the Kurds from all these peace-loving neighbors surrounding them?
I'm actually not going to accept the basis of your question. I don't think that it is, if we're going to talk about the Kurds are divided a community as I have ever met anywhere in the world. I dealt with the Kurds first in Turkey. I've dealt with the Kurds in Iraq. I've dealt with Kurds in exile as well. And there has been intra-Kurdish rivalry, a lot of, tribalism is the wrong word, a lot of focus on individual leaders who don't agree with each other. And it has been very difficult for Kurds to agree on very simple things. For example, you mentioned 2017, the September independence referendum in the Kurdistan region and other places outside the Kurdistan region. By and large, those who were lived in Erbil and Duhok and supported the KDP, supported the referendum, and those who supported the PUK and lived in Suleimania and Halabja and places in the east were against it because they saw it as a power grab by the KDP to make sure that if there was an independent Kurdistan, they would be in charge. I think part of there were, if you go back to the 1990s, fighting between Erbil and Suleimania, or Barzan and Suleimania, with on both sides at different places, the support of or asking for the support of the Iraqi government. So again, part of the problem with Iraq is that if you have a common identity but cannot exercise that common identity through governance and policies, it's very difficult to be effective. I spent a lot of time in the Kurdistan region. I think my final year as ambassador, I went 25 times in 52 weeks to Duhok, Erbil, Suleimania, Halabja, all over the Kurdistan region. I had not always good, but certainly frank relationships with Kurdish leaders in both of the major camps and outside the major camps. And even within the major political parties and factions, there is internal infighting that makes it hard for them to agree on their own policies, much less agree to the policies of a different political party or different Kurds with a different history of political leadership. So I think part of the problem in Iraq is that Kurds have not, at this point, taken advantage of the autonomy that they had been able to negotiate in the Constitutional Convention because they can't agree among themselves on the things that they want to accomplish. And I've often told my Kurdish colleagues in government in Iraq that really needs to be a major focus of their efforts. Find areas on which Erbil and Suleimania and most Kurds can agree, and then go to Baghdad with that agreement. It makes you stronger. The other thing that the Kurds have not really done inside Iraq is use the strong electoral power that they've got, the fact that there are a lot of Kurdish representatives in the National Assembly, in the parliament. And if Kurdistan were to vote as a bloc, they can much more effectively influence the choice of prime ministers, speakers and deputy speakers of parliament, and the political policies. But again, even in Baghdad, they often vote against one another or end up in different camps like right now. So I'm not blaming the Kurds. I'm just simply saying if there was a real desire for greater Kurdish autonomy or Kurdish independence at some point, there really needs to be, first of all, consensus among the Kurds as to how that would be accomplished. So and it's one of the things I talked to many Kurds about. How can you pull together a consensus of all Kurds, all the Kurdish, all the factions of the Kurdish leadership, so that you can confront Baghdad and Baghdad's policies that you don't like with the United Front. And in most cases, that hasn't happened yet.
Okay, thank you. I'm not going to ask more questions. Probably I would have more if there's no question. So I'm going to open the floor for our audience, and please kindly introduce yourself, and we have the mic right there. Probably you have to burn some calories and walk over there. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Greg F. Tandili, and I'm on the faculty here. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your comments. I'm curious about the remnants of ISIS, both in Syria and in Iraq. We know they've lost their territory, but the cells are still active. And there's also, as you know, there's been discussions recently between the U.S. and the Iraqi government about the 2,500 U.S. military trainers in Iraq. So if these trainers were to leave, is there a chance that ISIS could rebound or some version of ISIS could rebound? And is the Iraqi military capable at this point of dealing with that situation? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very good question. There's not a simple answer to the question because the issue is more complicated. The capabilities of the Iraqi security forces have improved greatly. The fight against ISIS, especially in 2016 and 2017, when they were better organized, when they had a more direct and complete battle plan that they were operating from, they learned a lot in those fights, particularly in the fight to liberate the city of Mosul, starting in 2016 and running into 2017. Syria is a little different from Iraq, but I'll take Iraq first. There are a couple of places where there are still remnants of ISIS hiding in caves in the mountains, in the Hamran Mountains, sort of east of Erbil, in some of the wadis out in Anbar province, probably up in Nineveh province as well. But I think the issue that may be more difficult is how can the Iraqi government act to make sure that not only the security forces, but also the local populations are identifying ISIS sympathizers, ISIS fighters, people who are training with arms in order to, in the future, support ISIS. What was interesting is the way in which ISIS was able in some places to easily take cities in Nineveh and Anbar provinces in 2014 and 2015, and other places where they were unable to take them because the local communities resisted. I think that one of the problems for the government in Baghdad is that many Sunnis in Nineveh and in Anbar, when faced with the choice of supporting ISIS or supporting the government, chose to support neither. They simply said, a pox on both their houses. We've not been happy with the way, the Shia government in Baghdad, as they would say it, has treated us. Nor do we really want to be ruled by ISIS, but we're not going to get involved. So I think that the apathy of the population and the lack of support for average people on the ground in places where there is a risk for a resurgence of ISIS is an issue that the Iraqi government needs to look at. It is not necessarily the police and military forces that are going to prevent ISIS from coming back, but rather people in the communities who don't want to see ISIS, people who saw the destruction that ISIS wreaked upon Iraq when they were running 40% of the country. The government in Iraq needs to make sure that their citizens that all citizens of Iraq feel that they have a real stake in the control of Baghdad, of their communities and the security of their communities. I think that what I'm worried about going forward, first of all, I'm not sure that there's going to be a complete withdrawal or expulsion of American and coalition troops. If you read, Yerevan mentioned an article in, I think it was The National, a daily from Abu Dhabi today, a long interview with Foreign Minister Fuad Hussein. He wove in among his arguments a number of reasons why American and coalition forces should remain in Iraq. And I think in general, there are many communities inside Iraq, certainly most Iraqi Kurds, almost every Iraqi Christian I met, a lot of Yazidis, who believe that part of the stability that they enjoy now, as opposed to during ISIS or before ISIS, is because there is an American security presence helping to advise the Iraqis on how to deal with threats well. And I think it just gives them a little more feeling that they are supported differently than they were between 2011 and 2014, for example, when American forces left the country. It's not an argument for them to stay, but what I have been saying ever since, especially October, when the calls for the departure of American and coalition forces have gone up, is that that is the view of the coordination framework which runs the government. It is probably not a universally held view inside Iraq, and there will be political controversy. And I think that this is a more complex negotiation that will result in something less than the full withdrawal of American and coalition forces. I think that the ability to plan, the ability to integrate an intelligence cycle, intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, operations planning, and then back again in big circles, is better when you have got, when the Iraqis have had American advisors helping in that process. As I said, they're better than they used to be. My big fear is that the same sort of thing will happen as happened between 2011 and 2014, is that the Iraqi forces will slowly lose that, some of the edge that they have now in the face of ISIS or other terrorist threats. But again, a complicated answer. If forces are withdrawn from Iraq, it will significantly impact what we can do in Syria. There may be other ways, and there may be other ways to supply the very much smaller number of American forces, either at Atanf base in southwestern Syria, right across from Tower 22 on the eastern edge of the Jordanian border, or in northeastern Syria, where some special operations forces are still working with the Syrian Democratic Forces. The ISIS elements in eastern Syria are a bit more dangerous. There is a large concentration of them, both in Al Hol camp, which also has a lot of Iraqi citizens who have not gone home yet, but also in an SDF-run internment camp, which is basically just confining potential ISIS fighters to a prison-like situation. I think that has potentially more danger in it than in Iraq. Again, I suspect that the U.S. military, if they feel there's a need to continue keeping those various forces in Syria, there will be other ways to supply them than through Iraq. It'll just be a little bit harder and perhaps a little more expensive. But I would be surprised if U.S. forces and coalition forces were withdrawn in the short term.
Hi, my name is Connie Zulam. I'm with the American Kurdish Information Network. What's your definition of national government? Do you think an average person in Baghdad, like an Arab person, would agree with that definition, and an average Kurd in Erbil? Related to that, is it conceivable to have a national government in Jerusalem that includes Arabs and Palestinians? Is it possible to have a national government in Baghdad that treats the Kurds equally? The world is pushing for two-state solution in Palestine. Why is it not comfortable with two-state solution in Iraq?
For me, I mean, as an American official, the definition of a national government in Baghdad was as stated in the Iraqi constitution, because it was, whether you like it or not, that is how the national government in Baghdad should be run. Those are the rules of the road. Like the constitution here is the rules of the road for the American national government. Do I like all the elements of it? Not particularly. I wasn't involved in the writing of the Constitution. And I think that there are those who take advantage of the situation on both sides or on all sides of the equation, not on both sides of the equation. There are clauses of the Iraqi Constitution that contradict other clauses of the Iraqi Constitution. So the problem is there's no effective way to, as I mentioned in my remarks, there's no effective way to make agreement or iron out the differences between the two. So a national government in Baghdad, it has to be based in the Iraqi constitution, because if it isn't, then all the rules are off. Does an average Kurd believe that this is what the definition of a national government in Iraq is? Probably not. But it is up to the representatives of Kurdistan to figure out, if Kurds do not like that definition, how to change it in Baghdad by forming alliances and by first and foremost agreeing among Kurds what they want to see changed in the constitution or in the policies of Baghdad. I'm not going to go into great depth about two-state solution other than to say in 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to, at the end of the British mandate, create an Arab state in Palestine, a Jewish state in Palestine, and an international zone that encompassed Jerusalem and the territory down toward Bethlehem. Jews in Palestine accepted that, announced the state of Israel, I think it was the 14th of May. And the next day, at the end of the British mandate, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, and some troops from Iraq invaded Palestine, both the Arab and the Israeli part, and the end of 10 months of war. The Israelis had control of 60% of what was to have been an independent Palestinian state. There is an international legal basis for a Palestinian state that doesn't exist for a Kurdish state. That doesn't mean it can't exist at some point in the future. But as I've talked to Kurdish leaders in Turkey, Kurdish leaders from Iran, Kurdish leaders in Syria, and Kurdish leaders in Iraq, there's no common vision of what a Kurdish state should look like. And frankly, not yet a serious legal argument and process to lead to the establishment of a Kurdish state. I think there's a lot more groundwork and planning that needs to be done. I frankly don't object to the idea of a Kurdish state. I think it would be a very difficult country to run. It would be very difficult for an independent Kurdish state to have good relations with most of its neighbors. But what is really lacking is a long-term agreed Kurdish plan to achieve independence. And without that, I think the chances are probably quite small, especially with opposition from Damascus, Ankara, Baghdad, and Tehran.
Hi, my name is Noe Doherty. I'm in the International Development Department upstairs. So a lot of your solutions that the US should be focusing on were development focused, which as a practitioner, I love it. But they were focused on education, college or transfer programs, climate programs, and economic liberalization. We've been doing that in various countries throughout Africa, throughout the Middle East for a lot of years with very different results. And a lot of the development community is split on how we should go about doing these certain things. For a diplomat, what changes do you want to see in these kinds of programs for practitioners to kind of put into practice? So if you were like king for a day, what would you kind of change for these programs besides increasing funding, which all of us agree that should be done? And like, how do practitioners better support diplomats to kind of get that to happen?
Boy, I'll give you two examples, but it's not comprehensive. The best way I think to spend U.S. government, this is not really development dollars, is in English language training and student exchange programs, because it's really important for students in Iraq and anywhere in the world that is not yet at the level of development that their country, that they aspire to. It's good for them to have a broader window on the world through a world language and to see something else other than their own country. So these are really good cost-effective programs, and it helps change the minds and the attitudes of kids on the ground. So that's my favorite kind of program. This is a few $1 million a year for Iraq. It's really not that much money compared to the other kind of assistance, military or development assistance. I think the Iraqi economy, we're not talking India in the 1960s, where we're trying to replace the kinds of grains and rice that they grow and make it more efficient. Iraq has got a sophisticated economy. You have a lot of really well-trained Iraqis. What you have is a combination of over-regulation and which has led to corruption, basically because of the large number of political and ethnic factions in the Iraqi government. The system has developed where most contracts, most steps forward, most spending of money by the government on anything, but especially on development projects, has got to be done by consensus in a committee, meaning that any one member of that committee has the ability to stop the project from going forward. That creates opportunities for corruption that are really quite difficult to overcome. If you have 1 or 2 people on a committee of 10 voting, you've got to win those two votes somehow. What I would specifically suggest is mostly deregulation of the Iraqi economy. And I'll give you an example where this worked. And it's based on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business survey. In 2012 and 2013, the World Bank, the IMF, the EU, and the United States essentially combined forces to get the Iraqis to look at the Ease of Doing Business survey and change regulations in the construction sector. And again, I'm going to get my numbers wrong, so you can look this up by looking at the old Ease of Doing Business surveys. But with the change of 4 or 5 federal regulations, Iraq's ranking in the construction sector for Ease of Doing Business went from something like 168th to about 120. And that was just 5 administrative changes. Now, since then, there's been a lot of pushback, and it broke a lot of rice bowls, and some of those have slid backwards. But a program that can systematically and over time change government regulations to make it possible for private sector Iraqis not to be shaken down by the electricity ministry or other government entities, not to have to pay bribes to Iraqi government officials to get their contracts approved or their land purchases approved, would probably do more than anything else. And the answer here is the Iraqi government needs to get out of the way of the private sector. And I don't mean big logistics corporations. I mean, people who own restaurants and bakeries and car repair shops, because those are the people, when they're successful, can multiply local employment many times. That said, the population of Iraq is now probably more than 45 million. The mean age of an Iraqi is 20. So if you meet an Iraqi on the street, he or she will be about 20 years old. By now, there should be at least 1 million Iraqis entering the job market every year. And these are problems which have not been directly addressed and frankly not really looked at seriously, because most Iraqi politicians are down in the weeds of figuring out how to game the system for the benefit of their own locality, their own militia, their own gang. So these are the 2 things I'd say. Invest a little bit more, but not a lot more, in English language training programs, especially those that give people internet skills so they can collect information from elsewhere, and deregulate the Iraqi economy to make it easier for the private sector to grow without a lot of outside stimulation and income.
I'll lean now. It's okay. Thank you first off for coming and talking with all of us. I'm a student in the Global Governance, Politics and Security program here. I just wanted to thank you again for coming and speaking, and thank you for bringing up climate as an issue that Iraq specifically faces. You know, the context I'm sure you're aware of, especially when it comes to water. The neighbors of Iraq have dammed up a lot of water sources coming into the country. And when asked about possibly letting more flow come through, they say, well, shouldn't Iraq really manage its water better? And on top of that, faulty infrastructure, much of which was left over even after, you know, our invasion in 2003, that was never repaired. A lot of that water leaks out and is lost before it ever reaches any of the sources, or is diverted by illegal diversions that have been placed on the ground by individual tribes or individual sects on the ground. So I guess I wanted to ask, with all that context in mind, what does a game plan look like for the United States in fixing that problem? And I guess maybe if I wanted to be more pointed, does the United States have a responsibility to do something about that problem?
Well, this will be controversial, but as somebody who's spent a lot of time there, I think the United States has a responsibility to help, but not to force the Iraqis to solve the problems that they've identified. We have poured billions of dollars into Iraq. Some of it has been used efficiently, but most of it has not. So that's the easy answer to the second question. We should help where we think targeted American assistance can do good, because we want Iraq to succeed. We don't want it to fall back into instability. But at this point, 21 years after 2003, Iraq has got to grasp its own problems, and there are simple things that they could do to improve the situation. In terms of water resource use, it's a little more complicated than that. I'll say, first of all, the Iraqi water distribution system before 2003 was an absolute mess. Water allocation had more to do with the loyalty of a village or a province to Saddam and his governance than it did anything else. Therefore, you had an awful lot of what are in some cases 4,000 and 5,000 year old irrigation canals dug by the Sumerians a long time ago, and just redug and redug thousands of times over again, that had gotten silted up because of lack of use, because of the political leanings of the communities. The United States worked very hard after 2003 to help correct that, and I have met in my time there with a number of Iraqi water resource ministers, all of whom seem to take their job very seriously. Honestly, I think I have closer relations with a lot of the water resources ministers than I have with other people I met in Iraq. They are consistently underfunded. They are consistently at cross purposes with provincial governments and communities. But they have had some success, actually different degrees of success with the different countries on the border. One minister told me very directly, I don't even know who to talk to in Iran because there is no Iran water minister. That's part of the oil ministry. And the Iranians are so water short that now they've basically cut off the flow of all water into Iraq from Iran, and have even diverted the flow of the big tributary across from Basra going into the Shat al-Arab into a canal on the Iranian side of the border. So Iran has not been particularly helpful to Iraq. And there isn't really anybody in Iran looking exclusively at Iran's water resources. These are often locally made, politically motivated decisions inside Iran. The Syrian government has been unable to do anything on the Euphrates in the east. They don't have troops there. They don't really control the area. But again, so Syria hasn't been a problem. I'm actually worried about water resources in Syria because they have been unable to defend themselves. The bright spot, and this is a dim bright spot, has been Iraq's relations with Turkey. The problem has been, for many years, Turkey said, we are going to constrain the flow in the Euphrates Valley with now 9 or 10 dams inside Turkey, but they had let the Tigris mostly run free. With the Ilisu Dam now constructed and and operational, they have, I don't want to say broken that promise, but there was an implied promise that they would never dam the Tigris River. They have done that, but they have been willing to delay the filling of the Ilissu Dam, raise the flow of water depending upon what's coming through other tributaries like the Zap that runs through Kurdistan. So I think that there's the possibility of bilateral deals between Iraq and Turkey, but I see, at least in the short term, no real possibility of a broader agreement between all the riparians. I mean, Iran really doesn't want to participate in this. Syria would like to be a little bit more engaged in how much water Turkey sends down the Euphrates, but up to this point, Damascus has just not been engaged at all. So I'm pleased with the people that the political parties have chosen to be ministers of water resources comparatively. But the systems they're dealing with are ancient or old. And one of the things that the United States has been trying to do is improve Iraq's understanding of more efficient water usage, helping to put into place regulations on the way water can be used. But again, ultimately, the traditional ways of irrigation for most Iraqi crops is very water inefficient. And it's a generational or two-generational change. And they probably don't have 1 or 2 generations to teach farmers and to give farmers the technology to grow the crops they're used to growing with that, with a significantly reduced water level. So this is an area where I think American policy can be successful, but climate change is affecting Iraq so badly. I remember taking a picture, this is 5-6 years ago. I was in Basra going to a meeting. It was 7:30 in the morning and it was 118 degrees. And I remember walking from my house to the cafeteria one day in, I think it was September. And I said, wow, it feels really cool this morning. The temperature has gone down and it was 98 degrees. Iraq has problems with precipitation. Iraq has problems with the neighbors distributing water. And they've got an old system that was relatively well designed when the water demands were consistent, but now you've got flows going up and down depending on snowfall and rainfall in the east and north. And I think we can help them do better with what they've got. I don't think we're going to solve the problem. They're going to have to change the system and focus on efficiency of water usage more than anything else.
I guess we're going to have the last question because we're running out of time. Thank you.
All right. Well, I kind of had 2, but I'll focus on one because it's probably more topical. Earlier, when you were giving your remarks, you pointed out that we have evolved into more of a multipolar world than we had in the 90s, early 2000s, et cetera. And I was curious how you see those changing dynamics and the rise and potential rise of regional powers with greater clout impacting things like the development of an independent, separate Kurdish state. And I guess by extension, I know historically there have been times when Iraq itself was a fairly strong regional power, particularly in the Arab world. And what would, if you see much, it being a long or a short-term potentiality of something like that being rediscovered for the Iraqi people?
A good question, and I will answer it in kind of 2 parts. Leave that last part for the second part of the answer. I think that the Middle East is one of the places in the world where the move toward multipolarity is the most obvious. The organization of which I'm the president, the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, was founded in 2014 because a group of Arab intellectuals, retired American diplomats, saw that the political and economic power of Cairo, Baghdad, Damascus, the traditional, and Beirut, the traditional centers of economy and culture in the Arab world, were simply sinking, and that Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Qatar in particular were rising because they had more consistent sources of revenue, they were younger, more ambitious leaders, and they were sort of engineering their own societies for the future. Having just spent the better part of 3 weeks in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, and in Kuwait. That is absolutely true. The changes, I had visited last Saudi Arabia in March of 2020 and almost got stuck in Riyadh as COVID shut the world down. The changes in Riyadh in 4 years since 2020 are truly breathtaking. Are they all positive? Not necessarily, but has society moved forward? Yes. And the enthusiasm that I see among Saudi youth and young people is really quite incredible. So there, on the social front, on the economic front, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, the UAE, countries that have significant amounts of revenue have been quite effective in turning their revenue into regional political power and are now pursuing policies that are meant to increase the well-being of their own populations, which is kind of what governments are supposed to do, at least in sort of a Western concept. So when I talk about multipolarity, I'm talking about countries like Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or Qatar making decisions on their own best interests, not by joining a bloc, but by saying, in this particular aspect, we want to create a sea and land corridor working with India through the either Duqm Port in Oman or Jebel Ali in the Emirates to join a rail system across Saudi Arabia that'll go up through Jordan and Israel or Syria or Egypt so that there will be alternate routes that might be less expensive than sea traffic. In other words, this is one area where you see groupings of countries that you wouldn't necessarily think of working together in the past as multipolarity. For Iraq, I mean, I have a vision of Iraq as a country that is powerful and unified and plays a mediating role in the region. And I think at least in the short term, for the next decade or maybe generation, the biggest comparative advantage of Iraq in geopolitics is going to be its ability to talk to everybody. One of the things that struck me about the interview that Foreign Minister Fuad Hussein gave to the National that Yerevan sent me this morning was that he considered both the United States and Iran as allies. Not many countries can say that. We pass messages back and forth to the Iranians, to the Iraqis on occasion, even though we have other more formal processes. The Iraqis were the first ones to get the Saudis and the Iranians to talk about what would be requirements to reestablish relations, because they had broken relations when Iranians had attacked the Saudi embassy and a Saudi consulate in 2016. It was Iraq probably at that point didn't have the push to get it done, and the Omanis took over, and then the Omanis didn't have the push, so the Saudis called in the Chinese, who hoped they could get Iran to concede on a couple of points, and it looked like they did. And now Saudi-Iranian relations are not confrontational, if not friendly, which is a step in the right direction. So the answer is, I think that Iraq needs to figure out how to plug itself into regional relationships, particularly on the economic side, that will be good for Iraq. And I think that Iraq will have a difficult time because so many economic decisions in Iraq are made because of political affiliation or a desire to move the country forward in a particular direction that not all Iraqis will agree with. And that's one of the reasons I want to see deregulation of the economy to have fewer decisions made by the Iraqi government and more made by Iraqi businesses and Iraqi individuals who have the wherewithal to move things forward. So Iraq has a long way to go. I mean, as does Damascus, as does Cairo, as does Beirut. But I think that if there is a vision of Iraq that is not as a member of the axis of resistance, there's a possibility. If the national identity of Iraq is encouraged among the population and in Iraqi messaging outside that we are going to be one of the key members of the axis of resistance, that's going to hurt Iraq's ability to plug into the global economy, to plug into global geopolitical decision-making, and that will probably not be to the benefit of Iraqi citizens. So there's a path that Iraq can go on. It's going to be slow, but that path can be easily interrupted by some political thought that is against it.
Thank you, Ambassador, for taking the time answering the questions and also for giving such a comprehensive analysis for so complex, issues with the Middle East and also Iraq in particular. So on behalf of School of International Service, the Global Kurdish Initiative for Peace, and also the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security decided to be a sponsor of this program as well. So we love to foster the collaboration, promote cooperation. I said, of course, you're welcome. So on behalf of all of them, I thank you very, very much for your time. And also for our audience, our next event will be on March 18. We're going to have a very comprehensive program on the Kurdish genocide. It starts from 10:30 to 2 p.m. We are going to have a great program, and also we're going to have an art exhibition that shows the Kurdish culture, Kurdish way of life, and also the Kurdish genocide as well. So please make sure that you're going to join us at that time as well. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the food and also networking. You're welcome to, come and say hello to the ambassador.